Hi there, Ms. Feil here, starting our third module, which is the fiction module, and fiction meaning, of course, not based in fact, or at least not factual enough to be considered based in fact. And the book we're going to be reading by Tim O'Brien, The Things They Carried, is a fictionalized version of his experience in Vietnam, because he was an active part of the military during that action. And I think something that we kind of need to get our minds around before we even start reading the book is the fact that Vietnam was a very different kind of war. First of all, it was never declared a war. We were allowed to go in there. Congress never declared war, which is what's required. There was an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin where supposedly our people were fired upon. It has simply come out since then that that never actually happened. So it was based on false information, kind of like our war on terror was based on false information being given. So our boys were, the vast majority of them were drafted, which means they had no choice. They simply received a draft number. There was a lottery. If your number was called, you went in for your medical and basic training. The other thing is that this was a war that we were fighting. We'll call it war because there's battling. A war that we were fighting very, very far away from home, which is not something that we did without really a personal connection to it. I mean, we went into World War II because we were attacked at Pearl Harbor. So there was a physical attack against the US, or we viewed a threat against the world. You see this kind of start to shift when you see the Korean War action. Again, not actually a war, but these people had been our allies in World War II, so we came to their help, especially considering that they were fighting a communist nation. And there was hysteria about communism at this period of time. This is actually the second peak of historic hysteria about communism and the continued complete misunderstanding of what communism is. We have never seen actual communism on this planet. We have seen countries call themselves communist, but none of them have actually been communist. They have dealt much more into the fascist lineup than they have ever done the communist lineup, which would be politically the end of the other spectrum, would be as far on the left as you can get away from fascism on the right. But we had fascism saying it was communism. And we can go into this more if you're interested, we can have a chat about it. But here's something else. We're fighting in a jungle war, so it's wet. It's always wet. That's why the farmers here farmed rice, because you need to have them in wet paddies, that they grow up in wet paddies. So these people's feet were never ever dry. Even though they're wearing combat boots, they're always wet. At night, they're digging foxholes into the ground, like 4.5 feet deep, that they can get in so they're not seen right away, so they can supposedly be safe enough to rest without being seen by the enemy. The other thing was, who was your enemy? Up until this time, wars were done by armies. There was an army on our side, an army on their side. Everybody was clearly marked by their uniforms, and those are the people that you shot at. Well, in Vietnam, the North Vietnamese or even the South Vietnamese that were helping them weren't in a uniform. These were villagers. They were working in their village. And we're talking really low tech villages, no running water, no electricity or anything. So very, and they're just trying to survive and feed their families, just in the subsistence labor that they have always done. So if the communists go by and say, hey, we're going to destroy your village if you don't help us, okay, they're going to help them. And then when the Americans come through and say, well, we're going to blow up your village if you don't help us, okay. So you end up with your enemy not clearly able to be identified from your non-combatants. And because people were being blackmailed into things left and right, you didn't know exactly if they were going to be your enemy today, your helper tomorrow, your enemy the day after that, because it all sort of depended on what they felt they needed to do to survive. So you're in a jungle, you're in, horrible heat, horrible humidity, you're sweating a lot. You're sweating so much you actually can't take in enough salt through eating. You actually have to take salt pills, which is literally what it sounds like, pills that are salt, to keep your electrolytes up so you don't have a heart attack. And because of this not knowing exactly where people were and who was doing what, wars had always been taking land. We took the Philippines, so that was our win in World War II. Or, we took Omaha Beach, that was a win. But in Vietnam, this never actually happened because you had Americans advancing during the day and taking a small chunk of land. And then pretty much at night, you had the North Vietnamese army and whoever else was out there helping them basically take it back at night. So property or land wasn't gained. There was no forward momentum as if you were winning a war and getting somewhere. So the way that they decided to count win or losses was entirely in body counts. Did we kill more of them than they killed of us today? And this was what was in every newspaper, the evening TV, everything back in the United States. This is how we are hearing this war. Well, this war, 42,000 Americans were killed, but they killed 86,000 Vietnamese. It's like, wow, not really a very helpful or good way to gauge whether you're winning a war. So why were we here? Well, that's another really good question because we had nothing really to do with Vietnam before this. The French were kind of sort of trying to keep it not communist because the fear of communism was everywhere. And they were losing badly. They wanted to get away from it. They asked the US to come in with some advisors, and then they just sort of, suddenly we were the advisors and the French were out of it. And we bought into this thing called the dominant theory because obviously, the USSR at that point in time, Russia, which was all of Northern Asia, was communist. And then in 1949, you had China go communist. All these little countries below there, someone somewhere came up with what they call the domino theory. So if one of these little countries falls and becomes communist, then all the rest of them are going to go. Like you've knocked down a series of dominoes. Okay, it's an interesting theory and it never actually happened, but over 10 years of war and a hell of a lot of death later, we find out that this is how we are counting out our war. And considering that we are just ending a war in Iraq in nearly the same way. Never was war actually declared, unless you want to call it the war on terror. You have to have a war against a sovereign entity. You can't have a war against an idea. And we just pulled out after 20 years because we started to read the writing on the wall that it's either going to be forever or here. And then once again, so this is very, very timely for these people who are coming home right now and the people who have served there for the last 20 years. That they will not, considering they didn't walk home as we won, they don't tend to be looked at very well by the general populace, and they don't tend to be cared for very well. Vietnam veterans were called baby killers and all sorts of awful things when they came home. They were discriminated against in almost every job. They had the worst homeless rates of any veteran force. But that's continuing to grow with each one of these incidents that we get involved with that actually don't involve a true war. We're not fighting against a single country. We're fighting against ideals or ideologies. And it just doesn't work out. And the interesting part is that a Chinese person, I think it's Lao Tzu, wrote back in 5000 BC, so that's 7,000 years ago, he wrote a book called The Art of War. And Everybody, every general on the planet has studied the art of war. And one of the things that is said in that book is you cannot have a huge invading force with long supply lines. So this invading force cannot be way away from home. This invading force will never win because it will become too costly and too unpopular in their home country. George Washington used this philosophy in the Revolutionary War. He knew that he didn't need to win a single battle at any point in time. All he needed to do was continue to have a force in the field. As long as there was somebody there to show up for the British to shoot at, it continued to be expensive and unpopular at home. And that's eventually what brought us around to the end of the Revolutionary War. This was the same in North Korea. This was the same in North Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh knew as long as he kept a force in the field, eventually this invading force from so far away on the other end of the planet would never, ever be able to continue this long enough to be able to come to a result that would be happy for them. So this information's been out there for 7,000 years, and we still tend to put ourselves in that whole idea of course we can invade nations on the other side of the globe, and we can continue to supply our people, and we will win this war by winning the hearts and minds of people who are there. And what we have been shown over hundreds of years is nation building doesn't work. We can't go in as an outside force and impose our ideas of democracy on people who have never seen a democracy and expect that to hold. And then turn it over to people who are used to running the place and kind of pulling all the money they can out, leaving the country. It's a bad idea. It's continued colonialism, and it won't work. We can go in and help people when we're asked, but not like this. On the day that I did my last day of student teaching, I had a student ask me, because they were being told at the beginning of the war on terror that, oh yes, it's going to be over in a week or two. Everybody's just going to lay down their arms and not fight back because they realize this is unjust. And I looked at him and I said, I think it's a really bad idea to go into a war expecting that your enemy is not going to fight back. And if we do this, we're going to be there for a really long time. And I hate that that actually turned out to be true. So let's back up, and we're going to start on the book. But first, I'm going to end this recording so that it's just an introduction recording. Okay, here we go.